In November of 1887, in the coal-dusted streets of Carbondale, Pennsylvania, workmen demolishing the old Hemlock Street boarding house discovered something that would make seasoned miners vomit into their lunch pails. Behind a false wall in the basement, they found the remains of 17 people pressed into the foundation itself, bones wrapped in decomposing fabric, skulls crushed flat as dinner plates, ribs woven through the masonry like iron reinforcement. But 17 was just the beginning. Over the next 6 weeks, as investigators carefully peeled back layer after layer of the building's structure, they would find human remains mixed into the walls of every floor. 45 victims in total, men, women, and 3 children, the youngest estimated at only 9 years old. The boarding house had operated for 12 years. Mrs. Adelaide Marsh, the proprietor, had vanished 3 days before demolition began. The Lackawanna County coroner sealed the official records in 1889. They remained buried in a courthouse basement for 63 years, stamped with a single word in faded red ink, SUPPRESSED. The question that haunted investigators then, and should disturb us now, wasn't just how one woman could kill 45 people without suspicion. It was why the walls needed to be fed at all. Before we continue with Adelaide Marsh and the horrifying truth behind Hemlock Street, if this story intrigues you, if you're drawn to the darkest corners of American history that textbooks deliberately forgot, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button. Ring the notification bell, because stories like this don't stay available forever. There are people, institutions, families with old money and older secrets who would prefer these tales remain buried with the bones. This channel is only for the bravest among you, only for true mystery seekers who can handle the unvarnished truth about what our ancestors were capable of, what they covered up, and what still lies hidden in the foundations of buildings you walk past every single day. Tell us in the comments what state or city you're from. You might be surprised, shocked, even to learn what happened in your own hometown, what's still there, waiting beneath the floorboards. Now let's descend into the world Adelaide Marsh created, one guest at a time. Carbondale, Pennsylvania, in the 1870s and 80s, was a town built on anthracite coal and sustained by constant motion. The Delaware and Hudson Canal Company had transformed a quiet valley into an industrial artery. By 1875, the town's population had swelled to nearly 8,000 souls, miners mostly, but also engineers, merchants, railroad men, and the countless service workers who fed, clothed, and housed them. It was a transient place. Men came seeking work in the mines. They stayed weeks, months, sometimes years. They moved on when the coal ran out or their lungs filled with black dust. They sent for families or didn't. They used real names or convenient ones. In Carbondale, you could be whoever you claimed to be because everyone was from somewhere else. The boarding houses lined streets like Hemlock, Salem, and River, narrow 3-story structures packed shoulder to shoulder, their windows glowing with lamplight through the perpetual coal haze. A working man could get a bed, 2 meals, and laundry service for $4 a week. The houses were always full. Landladies competed fiercely for tenants. Adelaide Marsh earned a reputation as one of the most respectable. She arrived in Carbondale in the spring of 1875, a widow of 38 with impeccable references from a boarding house in Scranton. She was handsome rather than pretty, tall, with steel-gray eyes and dark hair she wore in a severe bun. She dressed in black mourning clothes, though she never spoke of her deceased husband except to say he'd worked himself to death in the railroad yards. She purchased the Hemlock Street property with cash, a surprising amount of it, and immediately set about making improvements. Fresh paint, new mattresses, a locked cabinet in each room for valuables. She hired a colored woman named Parthenia Mills to help with cooking and laundry, and a local laborer, Samuel Gast, for heavy work and repairs. Within 6 months, Mrs. Marsh's establishment was known throughout Carbondale as the cleanest, quietest, most respectable boarding house in town. She accepted only employed men of sober habits, no drinking on premises, no women visitors after 8 o'clock. Church attendance on Sundays was strongly encouraged. The chief of police, William Braddock, often recommended Mrs. Marsh's establishment to newcomers seeking quality lodging. Dr. Theodore Wickham, who treated half of Carbondale's mining injuries, lived 2 doors down and considered Adelaide Marsh a model of propriety and Christian charity. Father Murphy at St. Rose Church regarded her as one of his most generous parishioners. For 12 years, no one suspected that respectable Mrs. Marsh was operating what would later be called a murder factory of unprecedented efficiency and cold calculation. Why would they? Boarders came and went. That was the nature of the business, the rhythm of coal country life. Men who disappeared had simply moved on to Wilkes-Barre or Scranton, or back to wherever they'd come from, Ireland, Poland, Wales, the exhausted farms of upstate New York. The town's transience was Adelaide Marsh's perfect camouflage. In a place where everyone was temporary, absence wasn't evidence. It was just Tuesday. The guest register at Mrs. Marsh's boarding house told a story of respectability and order. Her handwriting was elegant, each entry precisely dated: name, occupation, previous residence, room number. She kept accounts with mathematical exactness: rent collected, meals provided, laundry completed. Her kitchen was spotless. Her linens were boiled white every Monday. She attended St. Rose Church without fail, sitting in the 3rd pew on the left, her prayer book worn soft from use. A woman of exceptional character, Father Murphy would later testify, his voice breaking. I would have trusted her with my own mother. The performance was meticulous. When a boarder named Thomas Finnegan complained of chest pains in the winter of 1881, Adelaide personally walked through freezing rain to fetch Dr. Wickham. When young Patrick O'Donnell lost his mining job after an accident crushed 3 fingers on his left hand, she reduced his rent and allowed him to work off the difference with light household tasks. When Samuel Kowalski received news that his brother had died in Scranton, Adelaide insisted he take the train to the funeral and returned 2 weeks' rent to cover his expenses. These stories circulated through Carbondale's taverns and churches, building her reputation board by board. But there were signs, small inconsistencies that should have formed a pattern. In July of 1879, a miner named Henry Carver asked Dr. Wickham if he'd seen Jack Morrison, who'd been boarding at Mrs. Marsh's. Morrison had borrowed $3 and promised to repay it on payday, but hadn't been seen in over a week. Dr. Wickham mentioned it to Adelaide, who consulted her register and explained that Mr. Morrison had departed suddenly for a mining opportunity in Ohio. She'd found a note slipped under her door early one morning, along with that week's rent. He seemed excited about the prospects, she told the doctor. Henry Carver accepted this explanation. Men did leave suddenly when better opportunities beckoned. In the spring of 1882, a woman named Catherine Doyle arrived from Scranton searching for her husband Michael, a trackman for the D&H Railroad. She'd received 2 letters from him after he'd taken a room on Hemlock Street, then nothing for 7 weeks. Adelaide received Mrs. Doyle in her immaculate parlor, served tea, and expressed deep concern. She remembered Mr. Doyle well, A quiet man, sober habits, always paid on time. He left on a Thursday morning, early March, Adelaide said, checking her register. He told me he'd received word of work in Carbondale Township at one of the smaller operations. He seemed quite pleased about it. I assumed he'd send for you once he was settled. Catherine Doyle searched for 3 more days before returning to Scranton, heartbroken and empty-handed. She never saw Michael again. The pattern was perfect because it exploited what everyone already believed about coal country. People moved constantly, communication was unreliable, men sometimes abandoned families or simply disappeared into America's vast interior. Adelaide Marsh's explanations required no investigation because they confirmed what people expected. Samuel Gast, the handyman, was her unwitting enabler. A simple man of perhaps 50, he'd worked for Adelaide since her 2nd year in operation. He performed repairs, hauled coal for the furnace, and crucially, undertook extensive renovations. Mrs. Marsh was always improving the property. He would later tell investigators, his face pale and confused. She'd say a wall needed reinforcing, or we should add plaster here and there. She had very specific ideas about the work, always wanted it done when the house was quiet, when most boarders were at the mines. Said she didn't want to disturb the gentleman with hammering and dust. Samuel mixed the mortar according to her exact instructions. She provided the ingredients herself, kept them in locked bins in the basement. The mixture had to be of particular proportions, she insisted, for strength, for durability. He never questioned why the mortar sometimes contained fragments of cloth. He never wondered why Mrs. Marsh always swept the basement herself, never allowing him to clean there after their renovation projects. He never thought to ask why a boarding house needed quite so many interior walls reinforced quite so often. Dr. Wickham's role was equally innocent and equally crucial. Adelaide consulted him regularly about the health of her boarders, always so concerned, always so attentive to their welfare. She purchased medicines from him, laudanum for pain, chloral hydrate for sleeplessness, various tonics and remedies. For the men who work the deep shafts, she explained. They suffer so terribly with their nerves and their lungs. I like to keep a well-stocked medicine cabinet. Dr. Wickham thought her admirably charitable. He never calculated how much chloral hydrate one boarding house should require. Chief Braddock served as her final, unwitting shield. His recommendation carried weight in Carbondale. When he told newcomers that Mrs. Marsh's establishment was the finest in town, they believed him. More importantly, when the occasional inquiry came about a missing man who'd last been seen on Hemlock Street, the chief's response was shaped by his confidence in Adelaide's character. Mrs. Marsh keeps impeccable records, he'd say. If she says he moved on, that's gospel truth. By 1887, Adelaide Marsh had built a fortress of respectability around herself. Not of walls, though those would prove significant, but of trust. No one suspected because everyone knew her, and everyone knew she was beyond suspicion. That was her masterpiece, hiding in perfect, Christian, charitable plain sight. The first crack in Adelaide Marsh's carefully constructed facade appeared in September of 1887, though no one recognized it as such at the time. A railroad surveyor named James Holcomb came to Carbondale from Philadelphia, contracted by the D&H Canal Company to assess potential track expansions. He was an educated man, methodical, with a surveyor's eye for detail and discrepancy. He took a room at Mrs. Marsh's establishment on September 3rd, paying 2 weeks in advance. On September 11th, he failed to meet his supervisor at the surveying site. What made this disappearance different was James Holcomb's brother, Daniel Holcomb, an attorney in Philadelphia with connections to the state capitol. When James didn't return after 3 weeks and his letters stopped abruptly, Daniel didn't accept easy explanations. He arrived in Carbondale on October 2nd with the weight of the Philadelphia legal establishment behind him. Adelaide received him in her parlor as composed as ever. She consulted her register, her face arranged in sympathetic concern. "Your brother left on September 17th, she said, turning the ledger so Daniel could see the entry. "He said he'd received an urgent telegram calling him back to Philadelphia. A family matter, he indicated. I naturally assumed it concerned you or your parents." Daniel Holcomb stared at the entry. His brother's belongings were gone from the room. Adelaide explained she'd packed them carefully when he departed in such haste, and they awaited collection in her storage room. Everything was there: clothes, surveying instruments, personal effects. But something was wrong. "My brother didn't receive any telegram," Daniel said quietly. "There was no family emergency, and he would never abandon a contracted job without notice to the company." "Perhaps the telegram was in error," Adelaide suggested. "Or perhaps, and I say this with delicacy, Mr. Holcomb, your brother had personal reasons for departing that he didn't share with his employer or his family." It was a masterful deflection. She was suggesting scandal, impropriety, secrets. The kind of thing a respectable family wouldn't want investigated too closely. But Daniel Holcomb was not so easily dissuaded. He went to Chief Braddock and demanded a formal inquiry. The chief, somewhat reluctantly, questioned Adelaide again. He examined the register. He interviewed Samuel Gast, who confirmed he'd seen Mr. Holcomb leave early on the 17th, carrying a traveling bag. The investigation stalled. There was no evidence of foul play. Mrs. Marsh's account was consistent and supported by her meticulous records. The chief suggested that Mr. Holcomb had perhaps taken ill, or met with an accident on the road, or, uncomfortable pause, had reasons of a personal nature to disappear. Daniel Holcomb returned to Philadelphia unsatisfied but without recourse. Before leaving Carbondale, however, he did one thing that would prove significant. He spoke to Dr. Theodore Wickham. "Watch her," Daniel said, standing in the doctor's office. "I don't know what happened to my brother, but that woman is lying. I can feel it. Someone should be watching that house." Dr. Wickham promised he would, though he considered the request born more of grief than reason. But he kept his promise. The second incident occurred less than 3 weeks later. On October 29th, a Polish miner named Joseph Kowalczyk was drinking at Murphy's Tavern with 2 fellow boarders from Mrs. Marsh's establishment, Frank Butler and Thomas Riley. All 3 men worked the same shift at the No. 4 mine. Around 9 o'clock, Joseph began complaining of severe stomach pains. His companions helped him back to Hemlock Street, where Mrs. Marsh met them at the door with immediate concern. She helped Joseph to his 3rd-floor room, prepared a medicinal tea with laudanum for the pain, and assured Butler and Riley she would watch over their friend through the night. "I'll fetch Dr. Wickham if he worsens," she promised. Butler and Riley, both exhausted from the day's shift, retired to their own rooms. The next morning, Adelaide informed them at breakfast that Joseph had departed during the night. "He felt much better around midnight," she explained, serving eggs and fried bread. "He said the pain had passed, but he'd decided he was finished with mine work. Too dangerous, he said. His English wasn't strong, but I understood he intended to return to family in New York. He left payment for the week and was gone before dawn." Frank Butler frowned. Joseph didn't have a family in New York. He told me his only brother was still in Poland. Perhaps I misunderstood, Adelaide said smoothly. His English truly was quite poor. Thomas Riley went upstairs to check Joseph's room. It was empty, cleaned, the bed already made up with fresh linens. Joseph's belongings were gone, the few shirts he owned, his extra boots, the photograph of his mother he kept on the bedside table. It made no sense. Joseph had been in genuine agony the night before. Men don't recover from that kind of pain in hours and then walk away from paid lodging and a steady job before sunrise. But what was the alternative explanation? Butler and Riley discussed it in low voices at the mine. They mentioned it to other workers. The story circulated, gathering small embellishments: Joseph's sudden recovery, the early departure, Mrs. Marsh's vague explanation about New York. One version of the story reached Dr. Wickham's ears on November 3rd. He recalled Daniel Holcomb's warning, "Watch her." That afternoon, Dr. Wickham did something he'd never done before. He walked to Hemlock Street unannounced and knocked on Adelaide Marsh's door. She received him graciously, as always, offering tea in her parlor. "I heard about Mr. Kowalczyk's illness," the doctor said. "I'm surprised you didn't send for me." "He improved so rapidly," Adelaide replied. "By midnight he was asking for bread and butter. I saw no need to disturb you." And he left that same night. A man who'd been in agony hours before. Young men are resilient, doctor. Surely you've observed this in your practice. Dr. Wickham studied her face, the calm eyes, the slight smile, the posture of absolute certainty. He found himself uncertain how to proceed. What exactly was he accusing her of? On what evidence? "In the future," he said carefully, "I would appreciate being notified of any serious illness among your boarders, even if they seem to recover." "Of course, doctor, your concern is admirable." He left feeling unsettled but foolish. What did he suspect, really? That this church-going widow was somehow harming her tenants? The notion seemed absurd in the bright November sunlight. But that night, Dr. Wickham began keeping a journal. He noted the date of Joseph Kowalczyk's disappearance. He went back through his memory and added other names, men who'd left Mrs. Marsh's establishment suddenly, according to her reports. James Holcomb, Jack Morrison, Michael Doyle. Others he'd heard mentioned in passing. Over the next 2 weeks he added 3 more names. Arthur Pemberton left suddenly for work in Scranton. David Hughes returned to Wales to care for an ailing mother. Giuseppe Rossi departed for the Pittsburgh coalfields where wages were better. All explanations provided by Mrs. Marsh. All plausible, all unverifiable. On November 18th, Dr. Wickham did something that would later save his own life. He shared his journal with Chief Braddock. The third incident was the one that broke everything open. Parthenia Mills had worked for Adelaide Marsh since 1876, 11 years of cooking, cleaning, and laundry. She was a woman of perhaps 45, originally from Virginia, who'd come north after the war. She lived in a small room off the kitchen, worked 6 days a week, and attended the African Methodist Episcopal Church on Salem Street every Sunday. She was quiet, efficient, and Dr. Wickham would later realize, terrified. On November 20th, Parthenia appeared at Dr. Wickham's door just after dawn. Her hands were shaking. Her eyes were wide and red from crying. "I need to tell someone," she whispered, "before I lose my courage." Before she stopped, glancing over her shoulder at the empty street. Dr. Wickham brought her inside, sat her by his fire, and waited. What Parthenia Mills revealed in that quiet office would send investigators tearing apart 334 Hemlock Street board by board. "The basement," she said, her voice barely audible. "She doesn't let anyone down there except Mr. Gast, and only when she's with him. She always keeps it locked, but last night I heard sounds, hammering. After midnight, when the boarders were sleeping, I crept downstairs and I looked through the gap under the door." She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "There was a body on the floor, doctor, wrapped in canvas. And Mrs. Marsh was mixing mortar, so much mortar. She was humming like she does when she bakes bread on Sunday mornings." Dr. Wickham felt ice settle into his chest. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "Not known," Parthenia whispered. "Suspected, maybe for years. The men who leave so suddenly. Their belongings she says they took. I do the laundry, doctor. I know what clothes they owned. Sometimes she burns things in the furnace late at night. Shirts, trousers. Once I found a pair of spectacles in the ash bin, melted from the heat. Why didn't you come forward before?" Parthenia looked at him with exhausted eyes. "I'm a colored woman accusing a white church-going widow. Who would have believed me? And doctor," her voice dropped to a whisper, "I was afraid she'd put me in the walls too." Chief Braddock didn't want to believe it. Even with Dr. Wickham's journal and Parthenia Mills's testimony, the accusation seemed monstrous, impossible. But he was a lawman, and the law required investigation. On November 21st, 1887, Chief Braddock arrived at 334 Hemlock Street with 2 deputies and a warrant to search the premises. Adelaide Marsh received them with perfect composure, though something flickered in her steel-gray eyes, something that might have been amusing. "Of course, Chief," she said, "I have nothing to hide. Search wherever you like." They started in the basement. The door was locked with 3 separate mechanisms, unusual for an interior door. Samuel Gast provided the keys with shaking hands, seeming to understand for the first time that he'd been part of something terrible. The basement was immaculately clean, shelves of preserved foods, a coal furnace, tools hanging in neat rows, bins of sand, lime, and other masonry supplies, everything organized, everything normal. Chief Braddock felt relief flooding through him. This was all a terrible misunderstanding. Mrs. Marsh would be vindicated, and he would personally apologize for the "Chief," one of the deputies called. "Look at this wall." The east wall of the basement, running nearly 20 feet, had been recently plastered. The mortar was a slightly different shade than the surrounding foundation, newer, not yet fully cured. "We did repairs last month," Adelaide said calmly from the basement stairs. "Water seepage. The foundation needed reinforcement. Mixture. The body hadn't just been hidden behind the wall. It had been built into the wall, mixed into the very structure of the foundation like aggregate in concrete." Chief Braddock turned to Adelaide Marsh. She stood on the basement stairs, illuminated by lamplight, still wearing her black mourning dress and spotless white apron. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, his voice shaking, "you are under arrest for murder." "Which one?" Adelaide asked and smiled. "If this is giving you chills, if you're sitting there trying to comprehend how one woman systematically murdered her way through 45 human beings while an entire town called her respectable, I need you to do something. Share this video. Thinks they know the worst of human history. Share it with people who believe that evil is always recognizable, always obvious, always caught before it goes too far." Adelaide Marsh operated for 12 years in plain sight, under the noses of doctors, police chiefs, priests. 45 people fed into her walls while she served tea and attended church and kept the most beautiful ledgers in Carbondale. Hit that like button if you're ready to discover together what happens next, because what investigators found in the days following that first broken wall, what they discovered about Adelaide's methods, her motives, and her absolutely chilling level of organization, will make you question every authority figure who ever told you to trust them. The horror is just beginning. Let's descend deeper. Over the next 6 weeks, investigators would dismantle 334 Hemlock Street piece by piece. What they found transformed Adelaide Marsh from a local murderer into something that 1880s America struggled to categorize: a systematic killer of unprecedented scope and coldness. The full scope became clear on November 23rd, when structural engineers from Scranton arrived to assess the building's stability. Their report, preserved in the Lackawanna County Archives, contains language that veers between technical precision and barely controlled horror. The interior walls on all 3 floors show evidence of systematic reconstruction over a period of years. In 17 separate locations, human remains have been incorporated directly into the masonry structure. The mortar mixture in these sections contains bone fragments, crushed skull matter, and decomposed organic tissue ground fine enough to pass as aggregate material. The structural modifications appear purposeful rather than necessary. In the professional opinion of this board, the renovations were conducted specifically to accommodate human remains within the building's architecture. 17 locations, but that was just the beginning. As workers carefully excavated each wall section, they began finding bodies in different states of incorporation. Some were recent, wrapped in canvas, still largely intact, sealed behind thin plaster walls that Adelaide had apparently intended to finish later. Others had been there for years, reduced to scattered bones mixed so thoroughly into the mortar that separating them required painstaking archaeological precision. The coroner, Dr. Benjamin Hartwell, established a makeshift morgue in the Carbondale courthouse. His job was to identify victims and determine causes of death. Both tasks proved nearly impossible. Many of the remains are fragmentary beyond individual identification, he wrote in his preliminary report dated December 4, 1887. Bones have been deliberately broken, crushed with what appears to be a heavy mallet or sledgehammer prior to incorporation into the building materials. Skulls show consistent patterns of trauma. A single crushing blow to the base of the skull, delivered from behind, with sufficient force to cause instantaneous death. Quick, efficient, practiced. Dr. Hartwell estimated ages and sexes where possible. 32 adult males, 9 adult females, 3 children. One of the children was a girl between 9 and 11 years old. Her small skeleton had been found in a wall cavity on the 3rd floor, carefully arranged, almost tenderly positioned, still wearing the remains of a blue cotton dress. No one ever determined who she was. The investigation of Adelaide's private quarters revealed the systematic mind behind the horror. Her bedroom on the 2nd floor was spare and neat, a narrow bed, a wardrobe of black dresses, a Bible on the nightstand. But hidden beneath a false bottom in her wardrobe, investigators found a locked metal box. Inside were documents that read like a butcher's account ledger. 3 leather-bound journals, each containing detailed records in Adelaide's precise handwriting. Not the guest register she showed the public, this was her private accounting. Each entry followed the same format: name, Joseph Kowalczyk. Date acquired, October 29, 1887. Age approximately 28. Weight, £154 estimated. Payment status, current through November 3. Method, chloral hydrate in tea, 40 grains, unconscious within 20 minutes, neck broken at base of skull. Disposal. Basement east wall, section 4, mixed with standard mortar, 3 parts sand, 2 parts lime, 1 part cement. Bones required crushing. Set time 48 hours. Belongings burned. 2 shirts cotton, 1 pair boots worn, no value. Trousers wool burned. Photograph destroyed, 73 cents in pocket. Cover story, returned to family in New York. Told to Butler and Riley at breakfast, October 30. Every murder was documented with the same clinical precision. Methods, disposal techniques, cover stories, all recorded as if Adelaide were keeping track of household expenses rather than human lives. The journals went back to May 1875, 1 month after Adelaide had purchased the property. The first entry read, name, Peter Sullivan. Date acquired, May 17, 1875. Age, approximately 45. Weight, 168 pounds, estimated. Payment status, 1 week in advance. Method, first attempt. Morphine in the evening meal, insufficient dose. Subject became ill but suspicious. Told him food poisoning from bad meat. Second attempt, May 18. Chloral hydrate in medicinal tea. I told him it would help his stomach, 35 grains. Unconscious within 25 minutes. Suffocated with a pillow. It took 8 minutes. Unpleasant but effective. Disposal, problem, body too large to move alone. Samuel helped me carry what he believed was a rolled carpet to the basement. Temporary burial in coal bin. Must develop a better system. Belongings, kept money, $14.35, excellent. Burned clothing. Boots saved for Samuel, similar size. Cover story, told boarders he left for work in Scranton. Samuel believes the same. Need quicker method for rendering bodies manageable. Peter was strong and heavy. The coal bin is temporary only. Must consider permanent disposal that allows me to continue using the space. The journals showed Adelaide's evolution as a killer, her learning curve. Early entries were longer, more detailed, showing uncertainty and problem solving. Later entries became shorter, more efficient, refined by repetition. By 1879, she had perfected her system. Chloral hydrate in tea or medicinal tonic. She calculated precise dosages based on estimated body weight. Wait for unconsciousness, typically 15 to 30 minutes. A single blow to the base of the skull with a ball-peen hammer she kept wrapped in cloth in the basement. Death was instantaneous, minimal blood, minimal struggle. Then the methodical process of disposal. She would strip the bodies and burn the clothes in her furnace during the night. Any money or valuables she kept. The journals showed she'd accumulated over $800 from her victims over 12 years. A substantial sum. Items of no value were destroyed. Then came the butchery. In a corner of the basement, investigators found a work table, scrubbed clean but still showing dark stains that tested positive for human blood. Beside it, a collection of saws, heavy shears, and the ball-peen hammer, its handle worn smooth from use. Adelaide dismembered bodies methodically. Arms and legs separated at the joints, torsos opened and organs removed. These she burned. Bones she crushed with the hammer until they were fragmentary enough to mix into mortar. The entire process, according to her journals, took between 8 and 12 hours of work, usually spread over 2 nights. Then she would summon Samuel Gast for renovation work. She'd have him mix mortar according to her specifications that included crushed human bone. Together they would seal up a wall section, or reinforce a foundation, or add plaster to an interior partition. Samuel mixed the mortar. Samuel spread it. Samuel smoothed the walls. He was building a tomb, one trowelful at a time, and never knew. Dr. Wickham identified the chloral hydrate connection immediately. He checked his own records and felt his stomach turn. Over the course of 11 years, he had sold Adelaide Marsh enough chloral hydrate to kill 100 people. She'd purchased it in small quantities, regularly, always with a plausible explanation. For boarders suffering from mining accidents, from nightmares, from the various nervous complaints common to working men. I gave her the means, Dr. Wickham told investigators, his face gray with guilt. I trusted her with medicine meant to ease suffering, and she used it to murder people in their sleep. But chloral hydrate wasn't Adelaide's only pharmaceutical tool. Investigators found a locked cabinet in her kitchen containing morphine, laudanum, strychnine, marked as rat poison, and arsenic. They found a small notebook with dosage calculations written in her neat hand, crossed out and recalculated until she determined the precise amounts needed to render a grown man unconscious without killing him outright. She wanted them unconscious, not dead. Dead men might void their bowels, might suffer death spasms that created noise or mess. Unconscious men were simply sleeping. Unconscious men didn't fight when she crushed their skulls. The most disturbing discovery came from Adelaide's private journals, not the murder ledgers, but a separate diary investigators found hidden behind a loose brick in her bedroom fireplace. These entries were different, personal, reflective. June 3, 1876. Reverend Murphy preached today about charity, the Lord seeing all good works, treasuring them in heaven like coins in a purse. I thought about Peter Sullivan in the basement wall and Edward Morrison in the second-floor partition, and how the house is becoming a cathedral of sorts. Each one I take is a prayer made solid. The walls grow stronger. The house becomes more itself. I am building something that will outlast me, something permanent. September 12, 1878. 3 more this month. The house sings sometimes, late at night when the wind comes through. I think I'm grateful. It needs what I give it. Buildings are like people, they hunger. This one hungered from the moment I saw it. Empty rooms aching to be filled. Walls that wanted to be more than wood and plaster. I am feeding it what it needs. In return, it shelters me. It keeps my secrets. We are partners in this holy work. March 7, 1881. The child was necessary, though I regretted it. She was a waif, perhaps 9 years old, begging at the train station. No family. No one was looking for her. I gave her bread and milk and let her sleep in the kitchen. Her bones were so small they barely needed crushing. She went into the third-floor wall during renovations, and now that room feels different, softer somehow, sadder. The house accepted her but didn't sing afterward. Perhaps it prefers grown men. Perhaps children taste it wrong to it. I won't take another. The journals revealed Adelaide's delusion, or perhaps her genuine belief, that the house was a living entity requiring human sacrifice, that the walls needed to be fed not just to dispose of evidence, but because the building itself demanded it. Psychiatrists who later reviewed the documents debated whether Adelaide was insane or simply evil. Dr. Morton Prince of Boston, a pioneering psychologist, argued in an 1890 paper that Adelaide showed no evidence of conventional insanity, but rather a complete absence of moral faculty combined with extraordinary organizational capacity, a condition we might term moral imbecility. Others argued she was perfectly sane and fully aware that her supernatural justifications were simply that, justifications for murder committed for profit and convenience. The truth was likely simpler and more terrifying. Adelaide Marsh was killed because it solved her business problems and she enjoyed it. The victims, as they were slowly identified, told a consistent story. They were transients. Men without close family or whose families lived far away. Men who wouldn't be immediately missed. Men who carried cash, miners between paydays, railroad workers with accumulated wages, traveling salesmen. The 9 women were more puzzled until investigators reviewed Adelaide's journals more carefully. 5 were prostitutes she'd hired to clean or help with laundry, women whose disappearance wouldn't trigger investigation. 3 were women seeking work as domestic servants, drawn by advertisements Adelaide had placed in Scranton newspapers. 1 was listed only as the Irish woman, very drunk, found sleeping in my garden shed. No one will miss her. Adelaide chose her victims with care. She assessed them like a businesswoman evaluating inventory, their financial value, their likelihood of being sought, their physical size, easier to manage was better, their social connections. She noted all of this in her ledgers before she ever offered them poisoned tea. By December 1887, investigators had identified 23 of the 45 victims. The remaining 22 were nameless bones, people who'd entered 334 Hemlock Street and vanished so completely that even Adelaide's meticulous records couldn't restore their identities. The Carbondale Gazette published a list of the identified victims on December 18th. The article included a plea: if you knew these souls, if they were your brother, father, husband, or friend, the Lackawanna County coroner requests you come forward. Families came from Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, even as far as Illinois. They came looking for men who'd disappeared into the coal country years ago, men who'd stopped writing, men who'd promised to send for wives and children and never did. Not all of them had been murdered by Adelaide Marsh, but some had. A woman named Margaret Morrison identified her husband Edward from the description in Adelaide's journal: 45 years old, Scottish accent, missing left earlobe from mining accident. She'd been waiting 6 years for a letter that would never come. A man from Scranton recognized his brother Michael Doyle from the dates and description. He brought his brother's wife, Catherine, the same woman who'd searched Carbondale in 1882, drinking tea in Adelaide's parlor while her husband's bones were sealed into the basement wall 15 feet below. Every identification brought fresh grief. Every reading of Adelaide's cold, clinical descriptions of murder brought fresh horror. The people of Carbondale had trusted her. The church had honored her. The police had recommended her. Dr. Wickham had called her a friend, and she had been feeding their neighbors to the walls. As December 1887 turned to January 1888, the investigation into Adelaide Marsh expanded beyond the walls of 334 Hemlock Street. What investigators discovered suggested that the horror wasn't entirely contained to one boarding house or to one woman working alone. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: bank records. Daniel Holcomb, still seeking justice for his missing brother, had used his legal connections to subpoena Adelaide's financial records from the Carbondale National Bank. What he found raised disturbing questions. Between 1875 and 1887, Adelaide Marsh had made regular deposits totaling over $3,400, a staggering sum for a boarding house operator. Her ledgers showed she charged $4 per week for room and board. Even with a full house of 12 boarders paying consistently, her annual income should have been roughly $2,500. After expenses for food, coal, property taxes, and wages for Parthenia Mills and Samuel Gast, she should have been barely profitable. Yet her bank account showed steady accumulation of wealth. The money taken from victims, carefully documented in her private journals, accounted for only $847 over 12 years. Where was the rest coming from? On January 9, 1888, investigators made a discovery that would crack the case wider. A locked trunk in Adelaide's bedroom closet, hidden beneath a false floor. Inside were letters. Dozens of them spanning from 1873 to 1875, before Adelaide ever came to Carbondale. They were addressed to Mrs. Adelaide Marsh at various locations: Scranton, Pennsylvania, Wilkes-Barre, Pottsville. Each letter came from a different man, responding to advertisements Adelaide had placed in newspapers across the coal regions. The advertisements followed a pattern: respectable widow, 36, of good character and modest means, seeks correspondence with employed gentlemen of sober habits. Object matrimony. Reply to Box 247, Scranton Herald. The letters were courtship correspondence. Lonely miners and railroad men writing to the respectable widow who'd placed the advertisement. They wrote about their work, their savings, their dreams of settling down with a good woman. Several mentioned they had accumulated wages or money set aside for the right opportunity. And in the margins of several letters in Adelaide's handwriting were notations: $340 saved, works DH&C Railroad. $180, possibly more, no family from Wales. Claims $500, verify before proceeding. She was shopping for victims by mail. The correspondence trail went cold in early 1875, right before Adelaide purchased the Hemlock Street property. Investigators theorized that she'd arranged meetings with several of these men, assessed their financial worth and social isolation, and District Attorney Harrison Burke put it bluntly in a January 12th interview with the Scranton Times. "We believe Mrs. Marsh may have been killing for profit for years before she ever came to Carbondale. She may have murdered men she'd lured through matrimonial fraud, taken their savings, and moved to a new town to start the process again. Carbondale wasn't the beginning. It was simply where she decided to stop moving." Burke immediately sent requests to law enforcement in Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, and Pottsville. Had there been missing persons cases in 1873 to 1875, men who'd corresponded with a widow about matrimonial prospects and then vanished? The responses took weeks. When they arrived, they were chilling. Scranton Police Department, 3 separate inquiries 1873 to 1874 regarding missing men, last known to be courting or corresponding with a widow woman. Cases unsolved. The woman's identity was never established. Wilkes-Barre, 1 case 1874. Thomas Brennan, railroad worker, disappeared after telling friends he was meeting a lady from a newspaper advertisement. His savings, $280, withdrew from the bank 1 week before disappearance. Never seen again. Pottsville, 2 cases, 1873 and 1875. Both men were skilled workers with savings. Both had mentioned matrimonial prospects to colleagues. Both vanished completely. 8 men, possibly more, before Adelaide ever became Carbondale's respectable boarding house proprietor. But where were those bodies? If Adelaide's pattern held, she wouldn't have simply buried them or left them to be discovered. She would have disposed of them with her characteristic thoroughness. The answer came from an unexpected witness. On January 18th, a man named Robert Caldwell came forward in Scranton. He was a demolition contractor who'd worked throughout the coal regions in the 1870s. He'd read about the Hemlock Street case in the newspapers, and something had nagged at his memory. In the spring of 1874, he told Scranton police, "I did work on a boarding house on Monroe Street. The owner was a widow named Mrs. Marsh, Adelaide Marsh. She hired me to demolish an old addition at the back of the property, said it was structurally unsound." He paused, his face troubled. She was very particular about how the demolition should be handled. She wanted all debris hauled away and dumped in an old mine shaft outside town, said she'd made arrangements with the mine company. She insisted everything be removed. Wood, plaster, brick, foundation stones, everything. Said she didn't want any trace of the old structure remaining. At the time, I thought she was just unusually fastidious. But looking back now, knowing what I know, that addition wasn't structurally unsound at all. The foundation was solid. The walls were well made, professionally constructed. There was no reason to demolish it except. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Investigators traveled to Scranton and located the old mine shaft Caldwell had described. It had been sealed in 1876, filled with debris and capped with concrete. Reopening it would require significant excavation and pose serious. Haunted investigators was simple and terrible. How many more were there? The discovery of Adelaide's earlier crimes prompted another disturbing question. Was she working alone? The letters in the trunk provided the answer, though investigators initially missed its significance. Among the matrimonial correspondence was a different kind of letter, a series of exchanges between Adelaide and someone who signed only as H. The letters were careful, using vague language, but their meaning became clear with context. October 1872, from H to Adelaide. Your proposal regarding the property business has merit. I have successfully employed similar methods in St. Louis and Cincinnati with satisfactory results. The key is mobility and documentation. One must appear respectable above all else. I would be pleased to discuss techniques when we next meet. March 1873, from Adelaide to H. Your advice regarding disposal has proven invaluable. The building method you suggested is far superior to burial, more permanent, and it serves a practical purpose. I am currently acquiring a property in Scranton where I intend to implement the full system. The investment should prove profitable. July 1874, from H to Adelaide. I caution you against remaining in one location too long. Mobility is protection. However, if you insist on a permanent establishment, choose a transient population where disappearances cause minimal concern. Coal regions are ideal. I operated in Western Virginia mining towns for 3 years with excellent returns. The letters described a network, informal, loose, but real. People who killed for profit, who shared techniques, who advised each other on victim selection and body disposal. H wasn't Adelaide's only correspondent. Investigators found 3 other sets of letters from individuals in different parts of the country discussing the business in carefully coded language. District Attorney Burke understood immediately what this meant. Adelaide Marsh was part of a criminal subculture that authorities had barely acknowledged existed. Itinerant killers who moved between cities, targeting transient populations, disposing of bodies in ways that prevented discovery and identification. In 1888, there was no FBI, no National Criminal Database, no systematic way to track murders across jurisdictions. A killer could operate in Pittsburgh, murder several people, move to Philadelphia and start again, and police departments would never connect the cases. Adelaide had been smarter than most. She'd stopped moving and created a perfect killing ground in one location. But she hadn't invented the method. She'd learned it from others who'd been doing it for years, possibly decades. Burke wrote to police departments in St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Richmond, Virginia, cities mentioned in the letters. He asked them to investigate unsolved disappearances from the previous 15 years, particularly cases involving boarding houses or matrimonial fraud. The responses would take months. Some would never come at all, but one response arrived quickly from St. Louis, and it was deeply disturbing. Detective William Harrigan of the St. Louis Police Department wrote on February 14th, "We have long suspected the existence of what your letter describes, though we've been unable to prove it. Between 1865 and 1875, St. Louis experienced an unusual number of missing persons cases, primarily men of working class, traveling alone, last seen at boarding houses or mating, respectable women for matrimonial purposes. In 3 cases, we investigated boarding house operators on suspicion of foul play, but found no physical evidence. The proprietors, all women, interestingly, had impeccable reputations and meticulous records showing the missing men had departed for other cities. Without bodies, without witnesses, we had no case. One of these women was named Helen Garrett. She operated a boarding house on Carr Street from 1867 to 1871. Several boarders vanished during her tenure. When we questioned her in 1871, she was cooperative, composed, and completely credible. We found nothing. She left St. Louis in 1872. We have no record of her subsequent location. In your letter, you mention a correspondent who signed as H. I would be very interested to know if you have any physical description of this individual or any indication of whether H is male or female." Burke read the letter with growing dread. He returned to Adelaide's trunk and found the earliest letter from H, one he'd initially overlooked because it contained no useful information about criminal methodology. It was a short note, dated September 1872. "Dear Adelaide, it was delightful to make your acquaintance at the Widows' Social in Philadelphia last month. I find we have much in common, both in circumstance and in temperament. I would very much enjoy continuing our correspondence. Yours in friendship, Helen." Helen, not H for a man's name, but for Helen Garrett. District Attorney Burke sat back in his chair, feeling cold settle into his bones. It wasn't one woman operating alone in Carbondale. It was a network of women, widows, boarding house operators, respectable-seeming women, who killed transient men for profit and shared techniques for disposal and deception. How many were there? Operating in how many cities? How many bodies were sealed into the foundations of buildings across America, supporting structures that still stood, that people still lived in, never knowing they slept and ate and raised children above the bones of murdered strangers? On February 20th, Burke received another letter, this time from a journalist in Chicago named Samuel Everett. Everett had been following the Carbondale case and had done research of his own. "I have identified at least 12 cases between 1860 and 1887 in cities from Boston to San Francisco where boarding house operators, overwhelmingly female, were suspected of murdering transient boarders. Most cases were never prosecuted due to lack of physical evidence. In 5 cases, the suspected operator left town before investigation could be completed. I believe Mrs. Marsh is not an aberration, but an example of a widespread phenomenon we failed to recognize because the victims are socially invisible, transient workers, men without families, and the perpetrators are above suspicion, respectable widows, church-going women, meticulous housekeepers. The perfect crime is one that isn't recognized as a crime. How many bodies are in how many walls, and how many women are serving Sunday dinner in houses built on bones? Everett's letter included a list of suspected cases. Boston, 1863, boarding house on Charter Street, operated by widow Mrs. Rebecca Stone. 4 boarders disappeared over 18 months. Mrs. Stone left Boston suddenly in 1864. Building demolished 1885. No unusual remains reported, but no one was looking. Baltimore, 1871. Mrs. Catherine Drew, boarding house operator. Multiple disappearances. Investigation produced no evidence. Mrs. Drew died 1873. Property sold and substantially renovated. Again, no one was looking for bodies in the walls. Chicago, 1879. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell operated a boarding house on Clark Street. 3 confirmed disappearances. Investigation stalled. Mrs. Hartwell sold property and relocated to somewhere in Pennsylvania in 1881. Pennsylvania, 1881. Burke cross-referenced the name against records from Carbondale, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre. No Elizabeth Hartwell in any official documents. But in Adelaide's trunk, he found one more letter, dated November 1881, from someone who signed E.H. Dear Adelaide, I am newly arrived in Allentown and establishing myself. Thank you for your guidance regarding Pennsylvania markets. You were correct that the coal regions offer excellent opportunities. I hope we might visit when I am settled. Your devoted friend, E.H. Allentown was 90 miles south of Carbondale. Burke sent an urgent telegram to the Allentown Police Department. Investigate any boarding house operated by widow named Elizabeth Hartwell or using initials E.H. Suspect involvement in multiple murders. Urgent. The response came 3 days later. Elizabeth Hartwell operated a boarding house on Hamilton Street, 1882 to 1885. Property sold 1885 after Mrs. Hartwell's death, typhoid fever. New owners extensively renovated. Should we investigate? Burke wrote back immediately. Check the walls. On March 3, 1888, workers in Allentown broke open walls in the old boarding house on Hamilton Street. They found 8 bodies. The news broke nationally. The New York Times ran the headline, "Murder Houses, Growing Evidence of Nationwide Killing Conspiracy Among Boarding House Operators." The article triggered a panic. In cities across the country, people began looking at respectable boarding house widows with suspicion. Anonymous accusations flooded police departments. Some were baseless paranoia. Others led to legitimate investigations. In Pittsburgh, police investigated a boarding house where 3 men had disappeared in 1886. They found 2 bodies sealed behind a false wall in the cellar. In Cincinnati, authorities examined the former property of a widow who'd operated a boarding house in the 1870s. The building had been demolished in 1883, but records showed the owner had specifically requested all debris be dumped in the Ohio River. No one would ever know what had been disposed of. By April 1888, investigators had identified at least 7 cases, in addition to Adelaide Marsh, where boarding house operators had murdered multiple victims and concealed bodies within building structures. The network was real, the conspiracy was real, and Adelaide Marsh, sitting in the Lackawanna County Jail awaiting trial, had been just one participant in a killing enterprise that had likely claimed hundreds of victims across America over decades. The most disturbing part was that authorities knew they were only seeing a fraction of the truth. For every Adelaide Marsh who got caught, how many others died of old age, their secrets intact, their victims still entombed in walls that would stand for another century. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, just when we believed Adelaide Marsh was a monster unique in American history, we discover she was part of something so much bigger and more terrifying, a network, operating for decades. Respectable women in cities across America, killing transient men and sealing them into the architecture of the nation itself. Buildings that still stand today, homes that families still live in, walls that have never been opened. Share this video before it's too late, before this story gets buried again the way it was buried in 1889. There are people who don't want you asking questions about old buildings, about missing persons cases that were never solved, about respectable widows who operated boarding houses in your city, your town, maybe on your very street. This isn't just history, this is a warning. To our true crime family watching this, you are the reason these stories don't stay hidden. You are the reason the truth keeps surfacing no matter how deep they bury it. Now let's discover what happened when Adelaide Marsh finally faced justice, and why that justice was so much less than the 45 souls she fed to her walls deserved. The trial of Adelaide Marsh began on April 16, 1888, in the Lackawanna County Courthouse. It would become one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in Pennsylvania history, drawing journalists from as far as New York and Boston. District Attorney Harrison Burke faced an immediate problem. How do you try someone for 45 murders when you can only prove a handful? Of the 45 sets of remains recovered from 334 Hemlock Street, only 23 victims had been identified. Of those 23, only 12 could be definitively connected to Adelaide through her journals or witness testimony. For the others, there was physical evidence of murder, but no way to prove Adelaide was the killer beyond reasonable doubt. Burke made a strategic decision. He would try Adelaide for 3 murders only, selecting the cases with the strongest evidence chains. Count 1. The murder of Joseph Kowalczyk, October 29, 1887. Witnesses Frank Butler and Thomas Riley had seen Joseph in distress and watched Adelaide take him to his room. Parthenia Mills testified that she'd seen Adelaide mix something into Joseph's tea. Adelaide's own journal contained detailed documentation of the murder. Joseph's bones had been found in the basement wall exactly where Adelaide had noted. Count 2. The murder of James Holcomb, September 1887. Daniel Holcomb's testimony established his brother's disappearance. Adelaide's journal documented the killing. Fragments of a Philadelphia surveying instrument, identified by serial number as belonging to James Holcomb, had been found in the furnace ash, proving Adelaide had lied about his departure. Count 3. The murder of Michael Doyle, March 1882. His wife Catherine's testimony established his disappearance from the boarding house. Adelaide's journal documented the murder. Most damning. Michael Doyle had a distinctive surgical pin in his left femur from a railroad accident. That same surgical pin, confirmed by Dr. Wickham, who had performed the original surgery, was found embedded in the basement wall. 3 murders. If convicted on all counts, Adelaide faced death by hanging. The prosecution called witness after witness over 9 days of testimony. Dr. Wickham testified about the chloral hydrate purchases, his voice breaking as he described how Adelaide had exploited his trust. I gave her the means to murder, believing I was helping suffering men. I will carry that guilt to my grave. Parthenia Mills described what she'd witnessed over 11 years, the late-night hammering, the burning of clothes, the locked basement, Adelaide's insistence on privacy during renovation work. Her testimony was powerful, but the defense attacked her credibility relentlessly. "You're a colored woman who lived in that house for 11 years, Adelaide's attorney, Marcus Pemberton, said during cross-examination. You claim to have suspected murder, yet you said nothing. You continued working there, accepting wages from a woman you now claim is a monster. Why should this jury believe you weren't complicit?" Parthenia's answer was simple and devastating. "I was afraid she'd put me in the walls too. And I knew that a colored woman accusing a white church lady would be called a liar, just like you're calling me now." Samuel Gast testified about the renovation work, his face gray with shame. He described mixing mortar according to Adelaide's specifications, sealing walls, reinforcing foundations, never suspecting he was entombing human remains. "She was always so particular," he said, his voice barely audible. "Exact measurements, specific timing. She'd say the mortar had to cure undisturbed, so I shouldn't touch those walls after we finished. I thought she was just careful about her property. I never imagined." He broke down on the witness stand and couldn't continue. The coroner, Dr. Hartwell, presented medical evidence. He used anatomical diagrams to show the jury the crushing trauma to skulls, the systematic dismemberment, the deliberate fragmentation of bones. Several jurors looked ill. One asked to be excused and was denied. Daniel Holcomb testified about his brother's disappearance and his certainty that Adelaide had lied about the telegram. "My brother was a man of absolute reliability. He would never abandon a contracted job, never fail to notify his employer, never disappear without word to his family. The only explanation is that he couldn't contact us, because he was dead." Finally, Burke presented Adelaide's journals to the jury. He read selected passages aloud, the clinical descriptions of murder, the notation of victims' cash values, the experimentation with dosages and methods, the cold arithmetic of death. The courtroom sat in absolute silence as Burke read Adelaide's entry about the 9-year-old girl. "The child was necessary, though I regretted it. She was a waif, perhaps 9 years old, begging at the train station." One female juror was quietly weeping. The judge called a recess. The defense's strategy was as audacious as it was repulsive. Marcus Pemberton argued that while the journals were indeed written in Adelaide's hand, and while bodies had certainly been found in the walls, the prosecution couldn't prove beyond reasonable doubt that Adelaide herself had committed the murders. These journals could be fabrications, Pemberton argued. Perhaps Mrs. Marsh discovered the bodies herself, placed there by a previous owner or by person or persons unknown. Perhaps she documented them out of shock or confusion. Perhaps she wrote these journals under duress from the real killer, a man who threatened her life if she revealed his crimes. It was a desperate argument, almost insulting in its implausibility. But Pemberton was playing to the jury's deep reluctance to believe that a respectable, church-going woman could be capable of such systematic evil. "Look at the defendant," Pemberton said, gesturing to Adelaide. "Does she look like a monster? Does she appear to have the physical strength to overpower and kill 45 people? Mrs. Marsh is a woman of 51 years, slender build, no history of violence. The prosecution would have you believe she single-handedly murdered dozens of strong working men. I ask you to use your common sense. The argument had a certain surface logic. Adelaide didn't look like a killer. She sat calmly at the defense table, dressed in black mourning clothes, her steel-gray hair neatly arranged, her posture perfect. She looked like everyone's respectable aunt, not a systematic murderer. Burke dismantled the defense methodically in his closing argument. Mr. Pemberton asks you to believe that Mrs. Marsh discovered these bodies and documented them in elaborate journals rather than reporting them to authorities. He asks you to believe she was threatened by some mysterious man who forced her to write these detailed murder confessions. Yet this man is never mentioned in the journals themselves, and Mrs. Marsh never reported these threats to police, to her priest, to Dr. Wickham, to anyone. He asks you to look at Mrs. Marsh and see a slight woman incapable of murder, but murder by poison doesn't require strength. It requires only patience and access. Mrs. Marsh had both. She gave her victims chloral hydrate in their tea. They drank it willingly, trusting her. Once unconscious, a single blow to the base of the skull from a hammer requires no great strength, only precise aim. The dismemberment was done over hours, at her leisure, in a locked basement where she was never disturbed. Mrs. Marsh didn't overpower these men. She betrayed their trust. That requires no physical strength, only a complete absence of human conscience. Burke's final statement to the jury was brief. The defense asks you to disbelieve the evidence of your own eyes, the bones in the walls, the journals in her hand, the systematic pattern of disappearances. They ask you to imagine elaborate alternative explanations because the simple truth is too horrible to accept. But truth doesn't care whether we find it comfortable. 45 people entered 334 Hemlock Street and never left. Their bones support the walls of that building. Adelaide Marsh documented their murders in meticulous detail. She profited from their deaths. She fed them to her house one by one, and she felt no remorse. The question before you isn't whether this seems possible. The question is whether the evidence proves it beyond reasonable doubt. And gentlemen, the evidence is written in bones and blood, and Adelaide Marsh's own hand. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. They returned a verdict on April 27, 1888. Guilty on all 3 counts of murder in the first degree. Adelaide Marsh showed no reaction. She simply nodded slightly, as if confirming a business transaction. Judge Cornelius Whitman sentenced her to death by hanging. Under Pennsylvania law, the execution would take place within 60 days unless the governor granted clemency. Mrs. Marsh, Judge Whitman said, his voice heavy with disgust, you have been convicted of 3 murders, but the evidence suggests you committed 45. The law constrains what punishment we can impose, but divine justice knows no such constraints. May God have mercy on your soul, though I suspect you forfeited your soul long ago. Adelaide spoke then, for the first time during the entire trial. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant. Your Honor, I am prepared to meet my Maker with a clean conscience. I did what the house required of me. Every building has a foundation. Mine simply required a particular kind of strength. Future generations will live safely in that house because of what I provided. I regret nothing. The courtroom erupted in shouts and chaos. The judge had to pound his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Adelaide was led away, still calm, still composed. She would never show remorse. not in the 60 days before her scheduled execution, not in the interviews she granted to psychiatrists and journalists, not in the 3 additional confessions she eventually provided, but Adelaide Marsh never faced the hangman's noose. On May 15, 1888, less than 3 weeks after her conviction, Adelaide was found dead in her cell at the Lackawanna County Jail. The official cause of death, heart failure. The unofficial story, whispered but never proven. Adelaide had been given poison by a person or persons unknown, possibly a guard, possibly someone who'd paid a guard, possibly even someone from the network of boarding house killers who feared what else she might reveal. Dr. Wickham, who examined the body, noted in his private journal, "Her symptoms are consistent with strychnine poisoning, though I cannot prove it without more extensive examination, and authorities seem content to accept the heart failure diagnosis. Perhaps they prefer her dead. A hanging would have required her to stand before the public one more time. This way, she simply disappears quietly like her victims." Adelaide Marsh's death meant several things. First, justice was incomplete. She never faced execution for her crimes. She died on her own terms in her own time. Second, her knowledge died with her. She had been starting to provide information about the broader network, names, locations, techniques. Those confessions stopped with her death. Third, it allowed authorities to close the case quickly. A dead defendant meant no appeals, no prolonged legal process, no continued national attention on the horrifying reality of murder boarding houses. Within 6 months, the story began to fade from newspapers. The sensational aspects had been exhausted. The public's attention moved on. The fate of the others in the network was mixed. Helen Garrett, Adelaide's correspondent from St. Louis, was never found. Records show she left St. Louis in 1872 and vanished from all official documentation. She may have changed her name, or died, or simply moved somewhere investigators didn't look. Elizabeth Hartwell, whose victims were found in Allentown, was already dead by the time her crimes were discovered. She escaped all earthly justice. The Pittsburgh boarding house operator was arrested but never tried. The case was dismissed due to lack of evidence connecting her to the bodies found in her former property. She left Pennsylvania and disappeared. In total, of the 7 suspected members of the boarding house murder network identified during the investigation, only Adelaide Marsh ever faced trial. The rest either died before prosecution, fled to parts unknown, or were released for lack of evidence. Samuel Everett, the Chicago journalist who'd helped expose the network, wrote bitterly in 1889, "We discovered the tip of an iceberg and declared victory after chipping off that one visible piece. Beneath the surface, the mass remains, invisible, deadly, and undisturbed. The survivors, if you could call them that, carried scars." Parthenia Mills never worked in domestic service again. The trauma of 11 years living above a charnel house, sleeping in a building made of bones, destroyed her psychologically. She moved to Philadelphia to live with relatives and died in 1892 at the age of 49, of what was listed as nervous exhaustion. Samuel Gast was never charged with any crime. Investigators concluded he'd been genuinely ignorant of Adelaide's activities. But the guilt destroyed him anyway. He became an alcoholic and died in 1890 after walking in front of a cold train. Whether it was an accident or suicide, no one could say. Dr. Theodore Wickham never forgave himself for providing Adelaide with the means for murder. He continued practicing medicine in Carbondale, but developed a morphine addiction, using the same drugs he'd once sold to Adelaide, and died of an overdose in 1895. His suicide note, preserved in county records, contained a single sentence: "I have been haunted by 45 ghosts for 7 years, and I am too tired to carry them any longer." Chief Braddock served out his term, but didn't seek re-election. He'd recommended Adelaide's boarding house to dozens of men over the years. At least 3 of them ended up in her walls. He moved to Ohio and lived quietly until his death in 1903. Daniel Holcomb, who triggered the investigation by refusing to accept easy answers about his brother's disappearance, became an advocate for missing persons. He successfully lobbied Pennsylvania to create better record-keeping systems for transient populations and pushed for laws requiring boarding houses to report departures to local authorities. The laws passed in 1891 but were rarely enforced. Catherine Doyle, who'd searched for her husband Michael and drunk tea with his killer, never remarried. She died in 1910, still wearing her wedding ring. The building itself, 334 Hemlock Street, stood empty for 2 years while authorities decided what to do with it. Some argued it should be preserved as a warning, a monument to the victims. Others insisted it should be torn down and the grounds sanctified. In the end, economics decided the matter. Carbondale needed housing. The property had value. In 1890, the building was sold at auction to a developer from Scranton. He gutted the interior completely, removing every wall that had contained human remains, stripping it down to the bare frame. The bones were reburied in a mass grave at St. Rose Cemetery, marked with a simple stone. The Unknown of Hemlock Street, 1875 to 1887. May they rest in peace. The developer rebuilt the interior with entirely new walls, replastered everything, and converted the building into a multi-family dwelling. By 1892, families were living there again. The new residents were told nothing about the building's history. The property changed hands several more times over the following decades. It remained a residential building, apartments, boarding rooms, sometimes a rooming house again, through the 1950s. In 1961, the building was finally demolished to make way for a parking lot. When workers tore it, they rendered them invisible. Coal miners moved from town to town chasing work. Railroad men traveled constantly. Immigrants arrived with no family connections and thin documentation. When these men disappeared, there was no bureaucratic machinery to notice, no social safety net to catch their absence. They fell through the cracks of a rapidly industrializing nation that consumed workers as readily as it consumed coal and steel. Adelaide Marsh understood this instinctively. She didn't create the conditions that made her murders possible. She simply exploited them with ruthless efficiency. Dr. Morton Prince, the Boston psychologist who studied the case, wrote in 1891, "Mrs. Marsh is noteworthy not because she was aberrant, but because she was perfectly adapted to her environment. She identified a systemic vulnerability in American social organization and monetized it. In a different era, with different moral constraints, she might have been celebrated as an entrepreneur." It was a chilling observation, and not entirely wrong. Adelaide had the organizational skills of a successful businesswoman, the attention to detail of an accountant, and the strategic thinking of a military planner. She applied these talents to systematic murder, but the talents themselves were valued, even admired, when directed toward legitimate enterprise. The question that haunted social reformers in the wake of the case was, how many Adelaide Marshes were out there, operating undetected, because the infrastructure to catch them simply didn't exist? The Marsh case did trigger some reforms, though less than advocates hoped for. Pennsylvania passed the Boarding House Registration Act of 1891, requiring all commercial lodging establishments to maintain guest registers subject to police inspection, and to report weekly to local authorities about departures and new arrivals. The law was well-intentioned but poorly enforced. Most small towns lacked the administrative capacity to collect and review such records, and the law included no meaningful penalties for non-compliance. Several cities established missing persons bureaus as dedicated units within police departments, a direct response to the revelation that dozens of men had vanished from Carbondale without triggering any systematic investigation. These bureaus had mixed success. They were chronically underfunded and understaffed, and they struggled against the prevailing assumption that most missing adults had simply chosen to disappear. The case also contributed to growing awareness of what we might now call serial murder, though that term didn't exist in the 1880s. Criminologists and early psychologists began studying cases like Adelaide Marsh's, trying to understand what drove systematic, repeated killing for profit. But perhaps the most significant legacy was what didn't happen. There was no comprehensive investigation into the network of boarding house murders Adelaide had been part of. Helen Garrett and the others were never pursued with any vigor once the immediate sensation of the Marsh trial faded. No national database was created to track similar cases across jurisdictions. No federal law enforcement agency existed to coordinate such efforts. The infrastructure that might have exposed and destroyed the murder network simply didn't exist in 1888 America. And by the time such infrastructure developed, decades later, the trail had gone cold. Samuel Everett, the journalist who documented the network, spent years trying to interest authorities in a broader investigation. He wrote to the Attorney General, to senators, to anyone who might listen. His efforts went nowhere. In 1893, frustrated and disillusioned, Everett published a book, The Murder Houses, America's Hidden Epidemic of Predatory Boarding Establishments. It sold poorly and was largely ignored by mainstream reviewers. One critic dismissed it as sensationalistic fear-mongering directed at respectable widows engaged in honest business. Everett's book is now extremely rare. Only a handful of copies survive in university archives. But its central argument has proven prescient. Systematic murder by seemingly respectable people operating within legitimate business structures is uniquely difficult to detect and prevent, especially when victims are drawn from socially marginal populations. The Adelaide Marsh case also reveals something troubling about collective memory and willful forgetting. By 1900, just 12 years after the trial, the case had largely disappeared from public consciousness outside of Carbondale itself. National newspapers had moved on to other sensations. The reforms it had supposedly inspired were largely defunct or ignored. In Carbondale, the story became something people didn't talk about. It was bad for the town's reputation. It made people uncomfortable. Families who'd lived near Hemlock Street, who'd recommended Adelaide Marsh's establishment to friends and relatives, who'd attended church with her. They didn't want to remember that they'd been so thoroughly deceived. By the 1920s, younger residents of Carbondale had often never heard of Adelaide Marsh. The mass grave at St. Rose Cemetery was poorly marked and rarely visited. When the building was demolished in 1961, the local newspaper ran a brief story noting that a former boarding house was being cleared. No mention of its history, no reference to the 45 bodies that had been found there. The official records, court transcripts, police reports, Adelaide's journals, were sealed in 1889 and buried in the Lackawanna County Courthouse basement. They remained there for 63 years, marked SUPPRSSED, until a researcher named Margaret Holloway discovered them in 1952 while working on a doctoral dissertation about women and crime in the 19th century. Holloway's dissertation, The Invisible Predators, Female Serial Murder in Industrial America, brought the case back to limited academic attention. But even then, there was resistance. Her doctoral committee at Cornell University questioned whether she was sensationalizing the case, whether Adelaide Marsh was really a serial killer in any meaningful sense, whether the whole topic was suitable for serious scholarship. Holloway's work was eventually accepted, but it was never widely published. She died in 1967, and her research materials ended up scattered across various archives. The question is, why the determined forgetting? Why did a case that generated enormous headlines in 1888 virtually disappear within a generation? Part of the answer is gender. The idea that women could be systematic, organized, profit-motivated killers didn't fit comfortably into early 20th century narratives about female criminality, which tended to focus on crimes of passion or mental instability. Adelaide wasn't passionate or unstable. She was methodical and rational, which made her deeply threatening to social assumptions about feminine nature. Part of the answer is class. The victims were working men, transients, people without powerful advocates. Their deaths didn't carry the same cultural weight as the deaths of more prominent citizens. Once the immediate sensation faded, there was little institutional interest in memorializing them. And part of the answer is simply that the case was too disturbing. It suggested that evil could be completely hidden beneath surfaces of respectability, that trust could be weaponized, that the people and institutions meant to protect vulnerable populations had failed catastrophically. These are lessons that societies prefer not to learn. In our own time, the Adelaide Marsh case resonates in ways the Victorians might not have predicted. We recognize now what they struggled to acknowledge. That serial murder is not always a crime of rage or psychosis, but can be coldly economic. That the most successful predators are those who understand and exploit systemic vulnerabilities. That respectability is a tool, not evidence of character. We understand that marginalized populations, immigrants, transient workers, sex workers, homeless people, remain vulnerable in precisely the ways Adelaide's victims were vulnerable. They can still disappear without triggering comprehensive investigations. Their absences can still be explained away. Society has improved its record-keeping, but it hasn't fundamentally changed the reality that some lives are treated as more valuable, more worthy of protection than others. The boarding house murder network that Adelaide participated in has modern equivalents. Human trafficking networks that move victims across jurisdictions, exploiting the fact that no single agency has complete visibility. Financial fraud schemes that target elderly or isolated victims unlikely to report crimes or be believed if they do. Predators of all kinds who understand that the seams between jurisdictions, between agencies, between communities, are where accountability goes to die. And we still struggle with the cognitive dissonance of respectable monsters. When teachers, priests, doctors, community leaders are exposed as predators, we see the same disbelief that greeted accusations against Adelaide Marsh. The same reluctance to believe that someone so respectable could do something so terrible. The same tendency to demand impossible standards of proof when the accused, occupies a position of trust. Adelaide Marsh understood something that remains true. The best disguise for evil is a facade of virtue. The best hiding place for bodies is in plain sight, in structures that everyone sees but no one examines too closely. The 45 victims of 334 Hemlock Street remain largely nameless. 23 were identified in 1888. The remaining 22 are still unknown, just bones, numbered and catalogued by the coroner, then buried together in that mass grave at St. Rose Cemetery. We don't know their stories. We don't know where they came from, who loved them, what dreams they had when they arrived in Carbondale seeking work and a decent place to sleep. We know only how they died, trusting the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time. And we know that Adelaide Marsh, to the very end, felt no remorse. In one of her final interviews before her death, conducted by a psychiatrist from Philadelphia, Adelaide was asked if she felt any regret for the lives she'd taken. "Regret," she said, genuinely puzzled by the question. "I provided them with clean beds, good food, and a quick death they never saw coming. Many men suffer far worse in the mines. I simply incorporated them into something permanent. They became part of something larger than themselves. If anything, they should be grateful." The psychiatrist noted in his report, "Subject displays complete absence of moral understanding. She genuinely cannot comprehend why her actions are considered wrong. In her mind, she was engaged in a practical enterprise, no different than any other business. The fact that her business was murder is, to her, simply a technical detail." That might be the most chilling legacy of Adelaide Marsh, not that she was killed, but that she never understood why she shouldn't. The Adelaide Marsh case forced 19th-century America to confront an uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous predators don't lurk in dark alleys. They serve tea in parlors. They attend church on Sundays. They keep immaculate ledgers and smile at their neighbors and earn reputations as pillars of the community. The case revealed something darker about the social structure of the Gilded Age, how easily people could vanish when their lives were deemed insufficiently important to track. The transient workers who died in Adelaide's boarding house weren't nameless because Adelaide erased their identities. They were nameless because society had already rendered them invisible. Coal miners moved from town to town chasing work. Railroad men traveled constantly. Immigrants arrived with no family connections and thin documentation. When these men disappeared, there was no bureaucratic machinery to notice, no social safety net to catch their absence. They fell through the cracks of a rapidly industrializing nation that consumed workers as readily as it consumed coal and steel. Adelaide Marsh understood this instinctively. She didn't create the conditions that made her murders possible. She simply exploited them with ruthless efficiency. Dr. Morton Prince, the Boston psychologist who studied the case, wrote in 1891, "Mrs. Marsh is noteworthy not because she was aberrant, but because she was perfectly adapted to her environment. She identified a systemic vulnerability in American social organization and monetized it. In a different era, with different moral constraints, she might have been celebrated as an entrepreneur." It was a chilling observation, and not entirely wrong. Adelaide had the organizational skills of a successful businesswoman, the attention to detail of an accountant, and the strategic thinking of a military planner. She applied these talents to systematic murder, but the talents themselves were valued, even admired, when directed toward legitimate enterprise. The question that haunted social reformers in the wake of the case was, how many Adelaide Marshes were out there, operating undetected because the infrastructure to catch them simply didn't exist. The Marsh case did trigger some reforms, though less than advocates hoped for. Pennsylvania passed the Boarding House Registration Act of 1891, requiring all commercial lodging establishments to maintain guest registers subject to police inspection, and to report weekly to local authorities about departures and new arrivals. The law was well-intentioned but poorly enforced. Most small towns lacked the administrative capacity to collect and review such records, and the law included no meaningful penalties for non-compliance. Several cities established missing persons bureaus as dedicated units within police departments, a direct response to the revelation that dozens of men had vanished from Carbondale without triggering any systematic investigation. These bureaus had mixed success. They were chronically underfunded and understaffed, and they struggled against the prevailing assumption that most missing adults had simply chosen to disappear. The case also contributed to growing awareness of what we might now call serial murder, though that term didn't exist in the 1880s. Criminologists and early psychologists began studying cases like Adelaide Marsh's, trying to understand what drove systematic, repeated killing for profit. But perhaps the most significant legacy was what didn't happen. There was no comprehensive investigation into the network of boarding house murders Adelaide had been part of. Helen Garrett and the others were never pursued with any vigor once the immediate sensation of the Marsh trial faded. No national database was created to track similar cases across jurisdictions. No federal law enforcement agency existed to coordinate such efforts. The infrastructure that might have exposed and destroyed the murder network simply didn't exist in 1888 America. And by the time such infrastructure developed, decades later, the trail had gone cold. Samuel Everett, the journalist who documented the network, spent years trying to interest authorities in a broader investigation. He wrote to the Attorney General, to senators, to anyone who might listen. His efforts went nowhere. In 1893, frustrated and disillusioned, Everett published a book, The Murder Houses, America's Hidden Epidemic of Predatory Boarding Establishments. It sold poorly and was largely ignored by mainstream reviewers. One critic dismissed it as sensationalistic fear-mongering directed at respectable widows engaged in honest business. Everett's book is now extremely rare. Only a handful of copies survive in university archives. But its central argument has proven prescient. Systematic murder by seemingly respectable people operating within legitimate business structures is uniquely difficult to detect and prevent, especially when victims are drawn from socially marginal populations. The Adelaide Marsh case also reveals something troubling about collective memory and willful forgetting. By 1900, just 12 years after the trial, the case had largely disappeared from public consciousness outside of Carbondale itself. National newspapers had moved on to other sensations. The reforms it had supposedly inspired were largely defunct or ignored. In Carbondale, the story became something people didn't talk about. It was bad for the town's reputation. It made people uncomfortable. Families who'd lived near Hemlock Street, who'd recommended Adelaide Marsh's establishment to friends and relatives, who'd attended church with her. They didn't want to remember that they'd been so thoroughly deceived. By the 1920s, younger residents of Carbondale had often never heard of Adelaide Marsh. The mass grave at St. Rose Cemetery was poorly marked and rarely visited. When the building was demolished in 1961, the local newspaper ran a brief story noting that a former boarding house was being cleared. No mention of its history, no reference to the 45 bodies that had been found there. The official records, court transcripts, police reports, Adelaide's journals, were sealed in 1889 and buried in the Lackawanna County Courthouse basement. They remained there for 63 years, marked SUPPRESSED, until a researcher named Margaret Holloway discovered them in 1952 while working on a doctoral dissertation about women and crime in the 19th century. Holloway's dissertation, The Invisible Predators, Female Serial Murder in Industrial America, brought the case back to limited academic attention. But even then, there was resistance. Her doctoral committee at Cornell University questioned whether she was sensationalizing the case, whether Adelaide Marsh was really a serial killer in any meaningful sense, whether the whole topic was suitable for serious scholarship. Holloway's work was eventually accepted, but it was never widely published. She died in 1967, and her research materials ended up scattered across various archives. The question is, why the determined forgetting? Why did a case that generated enormous headlines in 1888 virtually disappear within a generation? Part of the answer is gender. The idea that women could be systematic, organized, profit-motivated killers didn't fit comfortably into early 20th century narratives about female criminality, which tended to focus on crimes of passion or mental instability. Adelaide wasn't passionate or unstable. She was methodical and rational, which made her deeply threatening to social assumptions about feminine nature. Part of the answer is class. The victims were working men, transients, people without powerful advocates. Their deaths didn't carry the same cultural weight as the deaths of more prominent citizens. Once the immediate sensation faded, there was little institutional interest in memorializing them. And part of the answer is simply that the case was too disturbing. It suggested that evil could be completely hidden beneath surfaces of respectability, that trust could be weaponized, that the people and institutions meant to protect vulnerable populations had failed catastrophically. These are lessons that societies prefer not to learn. In our own time, the Adelaide Marsh case resonates in ways the Victorians might not have predicted. We recognize now what they struggled to acknowledge. That serial murder is not always a crime of rage or psychosis, but can be coldly economic. That the most successful predators are those who understand and exploit systemic vulnerabilities. That respectability is a tool, not evidence of character. We understand that marginalized populations, immigrants, transient workers, sex workers, homeless people, remain vulnerable in precisely the ways Adelaide's victims were vulnerable. They can still disappear without triggering comprehensive investigations. Their absences can still be explained away. Society has improved its record-keeping, but it hasn't fundamentally changed the reality that some lives are treated as more valuable, more worthy of protection than others. The boarding house murder network that Adelaide participated in has modern equivalents. Human trafficking networks that move victims across jurisdictions, exploiting the fact that no single agency has complete visibility. Financial fraud schemes that target elderly or isolated victims unlikely to report crimes or be believed if they do. Predators of all kinds who understand that the seams between jurisdictions, between agencies, between communities, are where accountability goes to die. And we still struggle with the cognitive dissonance of respectable monsters. When teachers, priests, doctors, community leaders are exposed as predators, we see the same disbelief that greeted accusations against Adelaide Marsh. The same reluctance to believe that someone so respectable could do something so terrible. The same tendency to demand impossible standards of proof when the accused occupies a position of trust. Adelaide Marsh understood something that remains true. The best disguise for evil is a facade of virtue. The best hiding place for bodies is in plain sight, in structures that everyone sees but no one examines too closely. The 45 victims of 334 Hemlock Street remain largely nameless. 23 were identified in 1888. The remaining 22 are still unknown, just bones, numbered and catalogued by the coroner, then buried together in that mass grave at St. Rose Cemetery. We don't know their stories. We don't know where they came from, who loved them, what dreams they had when they arrived in Carbondale seeking work and a decent place to sleep. We know only how they died, trusting the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time. And we know that Adelaide Marsh, to the very end, felt no remorse. In one of her final interviews before her death, conducted by a psychiatrist from Philadelphia, Adelaide was asked if she felt any regret for the